I'm Paige, and I'm going to be doing the Chapter 1 kind of recap, and I apologize in advance for mispronouncing things. The Comanche originated as part of the Shoshones. They lived around like the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas. A distinct group of the Shoshones moved into the Central Plains, and that's where they started hunting bison. They were very successful there, but for some reason that's not super well known, it's theorized that it's because they knew down south there were horses. They started moving down south. There they entered the territory of the very powerful Utes, who actually, back in each tribe's lineage, they both did come from the Sierra Nevada, so they were able to form a really close alliance. The Utes introduced them to horsemanship, and this was really groundbreaking for them. Quote, "With the rise of equestrianism, Comanches could transport more meat, hides, and household utensils to markets, and they could search for prey over a wider range and kill animals more effectively. Their reach of trade was multiplied, as was their ability to wage war, plunder, and defend themselves. In an instant, the world became smaller and its resources more accessible." One of the main things they did with these horses is they became very powerful slave traders. They would raid Apache settlements and sell the captives as slaves. The Comanche and Apache began fighting because both groups really relied on, in the Great Plains, the river valleys for their sustenance, so that's why the fighting got particularly brutal. But the Apaches, they were a little bit more sedentary. They had kind of adopted farming, so they were much more vulnerable to the Comanche attacks. So the Apaches kind of fled to the Spanish and asked for assistance. Spanish New Mexico decided that it was in their best interest to help the Apaches, and that's how Spain became involved with the Comanches. At the same time, some of the territory they had taken over when they moved south was occupied by other Apache nations, and even though they had successfully taken it, they had kind of inherited some border disputes. So at this time, they had kind of a three-sided war, and it was really kind of a pivotal moment in their expansion. Eventually, there was a new governor of the Spanish New Mexico province, and he really favored, he saw the threat of the Comanches, and he favored kind of reaching out to them and getting to know them more and making a peace. The Comanches definitely had the upper hand, but they were able to reach a peace accord. And so as the Comanche-Apache War started dwindling down, the Utes and the Comanche, who had been side by side kind of for all of this, they began to kind of break apart. It's potentially because the Utes were a little more sedentary than the Apache, and just the alliance was no longer useful. Quote, "Comanche-Ute conflict started out as a clash between two former allies, but soon escalated into a major Borderlands war. Utes, having tutored Comanches in equestrianism, now found themselves powerless against Comanche cavalry." The Comanches' next kind of phase of expansion is they moved east to kind of the southern plains of Texas. As they expanded this direction, they were able to tap into the Upper Arkansas Basin trade network, which was super extensive. They did a lot of trade with through a different tribe with the French, and that's how they got a lot of like muskets and iron tools. Here they formed a really great alliance again called the Norteños. This group of alliances, they were fighting against the Lipins, who are another Apache group in the area. And again, the Lipins Apaches had to kind of flee to Spanish Texas this time. Again, Spanish government decided to help them, but they were really poorly defended, and the Comanches were really able to kind of easily overtake them. So the Spanish decided this isn't worth it anymore. So they were able to kind of move all the Apaches off this southern plains of Texas, so this whole realm became Comancheria. It ranged from New Mexico, from Taos to Albuquerque, and then on the eastern side, they were only like a day's ride from San Antonio. So they had amassed quite a big amount of land. So now the two Spanish sister colonies of New Mexico and Texas, in order to travel between them, they would actually have to go south to avoid Comancheria and also Apacheria, which was even further south, and is where a lot of the Apache tribes kind of recongregated after they were kind of kicked off the plains. The Comanche were able to establish all this empire building. Yes, militarily, they did have a very strong military, and they used guerrilla tactics, and they were very successful that way. But the author wanted to note that it was also diplomatic and economic reasons. As far as economics go, their use of the plains and their kind of ability to harvest all the natural energies from the region really made their economy super strong. And then diplomatically, they were very good at forming alliances and playing different groups off of each other, and knowing when an alliance kind of no longer served them. They were also good at, they kind of adapted the Spanish mindset towards them. So the Spanish still viewed them as savages and barbarians, but they kind of had to start to concede to doing things the way the Comanche wanted to a little bit more, so according to like Comanche principles and traditions. I also want to emphasize the peace accords. So there had been, this was during the Comanche-Apache War, so more at the beginning of this, more the beginning, middle of the century, and there had long been kind of there would be little periods of more peace, and then the Spanish would the Spanish would be involved, and then they kind of get less involved, things like that. So there were a series of different kind of meetings. Quote, "These proceedings, which mirrored and built on the negotiations 10 years earlier, were more than peace talks. They were an attempt to create a political and cultural middle ground between two nations." Quechupin, the Spanish governor of New Mexico, who was very influential in reaching out to the Comanche more, had realized that peace with Indian nations depended on gifting and personal bonds rather than just institutional ties. So the reason that the Comanche were able to do all this while the other tribes in the area kind of got overtaken by them is, the author argues, largely to do with how Comanches thought of themselves and the fact that they were so fluid with it. Other tribes were more kind of set in their ways, or if they had begun traditions, they didn't really morph themselves to kind of the changing environment. But the Comanche were more fluid in their conception of themselves. Quote, "Equestrianism represented to them merely a stage in an expedited evolutionary continuum that had witnessed them migrating from the Central Plains to the Southern Rocky Mountains, and in the space of a few years, transforming themselves from stone and bone using pedestrian hunters into horse-mounted, gun and metal using slave and livestock traders on the Spanish borderlands. Their incredible cavalry and fierce guerrilla tactics were simply an application of overwhelming economic and demographic power made available by adaptive fluency." Key things I would want to highlight would be the Ute-Comanche alliance that was really strong for pretty much the first half of the 17th century. And then the latter half of the 17th century, the alliance they had in the Norteños, that was super strong. The really big peace accord happened in 1762. And again, that's around the time that the Ute-Comanche alliance starts breaking down.